Good morning, everyone. And we are live. Good to see you all today. Sorry for the late start. I had to mute myself so I don't get confused. There we go. Sorry for the late start. I had a bit of a lie-in. It's Sunday morning here in Germany. And on top of that, I had to read how everything is awful back in Australia, where I'm from. So I think the local COVID cluster is up to 68, I saw this morning. So after a couple weeks of feeling like they'd beat it, suddenly everyone's Christmas is canceled. So I had to read all about that. And then we had a big breakfast, a very Bavarian tradition called the Weisswurst Frühstück breakfast. Good morning, Margaret. Nice to see you there. Which is pretzels and Weisswurst, which is a German sausage. It's a very white sausage, so I actually need to look up what's in it. It's sort of, spiced. It's a very finely ground, whatever it is. And I guess similar to like a boudin blanc, I guess. And you have that with pretzels, freshly baked. You can buy pretzels here in the freezer section of the grocery store and bake them in the oven, giant pretzels. It's amazing. So we had pretzels and Weisswurst, and you have it with special mustard, Weisswurst Senf, which is very sweet. And so you have that, and sometimes we have beer. I did not have beer today, so excuse me. So I'm appropriately carbed and fueled here, and ready to knit. But yeah, it's the end of 2020. I figure I'm to be forgiven for not necessarily starting exactly at the planned time. Am I in the middle? I'm kind of in the middle. So we are still powering away on Lenatus. You will recall that I had hoped to have had it finished by the time AWS reInvent finished on Friday. This is the big conference that my work has been putting on online, which finished up technically on Friday, and I'm not done. But I did crank through quite a lot of the body of this thing during the many sessions that I watched. So if I turn it around, so again, for those of you who are new, this is this is the back, but you'll get the idea. So that is the yoke, which is the part around the neck and the shoulders of the jumper. Why am I not quite in the middle here? No, wrong way. That way. There we go. Yeah, so it's that's the yoke design, and now I am doing the body of the jumper, which is just a lot of plain knitting. And I did actually do a fit check last night. So we showed this last week. I'm currently using interchangeable needles. So as you'll recall, the tips of these are the Addy clicks. The tips of these circular needles actually come off. And so what I did is I have, I joined up two cables together. I have a joiner. And so that makes it long enough to go around me so that I can get it over my head and try it on around my waist and see what it looks like. Let me click it back together. Because remember, we had a bit of a blowout last week where my needle tip came off while I was knitting, and I had to rescue all those stitches and fix them, and that's never fun. Okay, so I did try it on last night, and this is the current state of affairs. So as you can see, it's getting there. I'm not looking to make a crop top. Sorry to disappoint any of you. So I am not done yet. I still have, oh God, another 4 to 6 inches to go. I mean, this is meant to be a fairly relaxed fit around the waist. So I, probably want it longer rather than shorter. So yeah, I'm not done yet. Still going. And then of course it needs sleeves. So I will then need to pick up around the armholes there, which are currently on waist yarn. I can show you that for those of you who haven't seen it. So I started this jumper from the top down. I increased through the yoke, and then when I got to the armpits, I slipped the armhole stitches. You can see they're threaded. They're still live. They're threaded onto some scrap wool there. Yes, the sea of stockinette is absolutely right. Welcome, Woban do Underdog. Yes, endless endless sea of stockinette stitch. I remember now why I don't usually do projects like this. And I then cast on a few extra stitches under the underarm. This is to make what we call a gusset under the arm. Basically, because you need a few extra stitches under the armhole to give you, freedom of movement there. You wouldn't want the armhole to just be like a slit like that. So that opens up the armhole a little bit. And so later what I will do is on my needle, I will pick up all those live stitches. I will put them back on the needle, and then I will actually create a few stitches by picking up along this casted on edge here, and then I will knit the armholes down. So that is the plan. I'm undecided yet whether to knit long sleeve or short sleeve. The pattern provides both. I'm thinking about long sleeve. It's cold here. I can certainly wear a long sleeve. So that's kind of the plan. But yeah, it's taking forever. And then I made the mistake last night of asking Rod, my husband, because I haven't knitted him a jumper in a while, what he would like. And I said, we're in Munich. I want to knit you a new jumper. And he said, maybe something thin to go under a jacket. And I'm like, no. I was thinking something super bulky that will knit up very quickly. But alas, he also wants, thinner pieces like this are better for layering. They really are. And, they're a bit more flexible. They just take quite a lot. Luckily, he's not as small as he used to be, but he's not a giant guy. So it won't take a huge amount of time, but still it will take longer than it would if it were a chunky knit. So yeah, thinking about new projects. But I got to finish this one first. I did get the book. So for those of you who are just joining, this pattern is called Lenatus by Susan Crawford. The details are to your left, actually should be right below where I am on the screen right now. So it's Lenatus, which I believe has something to do with the scientific name for a watermelon. I don't know why she's chosen that name for this jumper. Actually, it's probably because in the book version, it's red with white, because it would be red and black in a watermelon kind of, isn't it? I don't know. It's called Lenatus. And it's from the book Evolution, which is a new book of knitting pattern designs she's done, which are sort of very traditional designs, but sort of evolved slightly to be a bit more modern. And I'm using Lana Grossa Cool Wool Fine, which is 100% merino in a sort of a fingering weight, which is obviously a thin yarn. It's very soft. It's quite soft. And the book, Evolution, so what the author did was something really cool, is if you bought the book, which was in the process of being published, she would send you the pattern as a PDF so that you could actually start knitting from it before the book was published. I have just finally received the published book, which is wonderful, and I haven't actually opened it yet because I'm actually gifting the book to a friend of mine. So I am just going to knit this one pattern, and then I'm going to gift the book to a friend of mine as a birthday gift for Jody. Yay! So it's still in the box. And Woban says, my current knitting is worsted held double, which makes knitting very fast. I didn't need to hear that. That's super chunky. You could knit a blanket or a jumper in a matter of, a week. Oh, I'm jealous. And I could wear that here. I mean, it is cold enough here to wear things like that. You just can't quite get them under a jacket. Speaking of which, the jumper that I'm wearing today. So the jumper that I'm wearing today is one that I knitted many, many years ago. This is Solstice by Joe Sharp. It is knitted in Joe Sharp 8-ply wool, which is an Australian merino. And the interesting thing about this design, I'm going to put my sleeve under the camera so you can see it a bit better. Yeah, I love the colors, first of all. That's what made me fall in love with it. But the interesting thing is that this pattern uses slipped stitches. So you see there are rows here that have two colors in them. Well, the great thing about slip stitch designs is you actually only ever use one color at a time. So the thing I had to do where you hold one in each hand and you're weaving them back and forth, you don't have to do that with slip stitch knitting. So you can get quite a sophisticated design that looks like you're doing multicolor, but you're actually only ever wrestling with one color at a time. It's super easy. I actually made this jumper very early in my career as a knitter, like within the first couple years. And so it's mainly stocking stitch. Like if you look at it, it's mainly stocking stitch. It's knitted flat. It's not knitted in the round. It is, the front and back are giant rectangles. You can see it is also a drop sleeve. So that is where the sleeve is just a solid line. So you knit rectangles for the front, rectangles for the sleeves, and then you sew the sleeves on, and then you sew up this long seam down the body. So it's no shaping whatsoever. It's very big in 80s and sort of over, like it's huge. I mean, I probably also knitted too large of a size, but I don't mind. I knit it, I wear it sort of over other things. Woven says, it's lovely. I bet that had a lot of ends. Well, that's the funny story. Because see, while I love the pattern and I was great at knitting the garment, I didn't do a great job of putting it together. Not that you would know now. So what I did is I finished, I blocked the pieces as you're supposed to do, which we talked about that last week. That's where you wash them and you pin them out flat and everything. And so you pin out this rectangle. Can I draw it for you so you can at least see what I'm talking about here? Let me get a piece of paper. Pull up my notebook. Okay, so let's assume, so you have a rectangle for the body, and you have an additional rectangle for the back. And so the first thing you do is you sew those together at the shoulders. So imagine, if you will, this is, you're looking down at it. And so maybe that's the front, that's the back. There is a neck hole in the middle. And so these are your shoulder seams. And so what you do is you're actually, your sleeves that you've knitted are sort of a trapezoid shape, like that. And the goal is you want to sew the sleeves on like that, centered on the shoulder sleeves. And you want to sort of sew them down very, you don't want to do it tightly is the thing. Because you see, it's got sort of, it doesn't bunch in there. And the problem is I had never done a drop shoulders are not as easy as they look. Like I said, there's not a lot of shaping. There's not a lot of complicated curves, which makes it sound easy, but sewing these together is a little bit trickier than I realized at the time, was probably beyond my ability as a finisher, to finish a garment. And so when I sewed it, these seams here, so I sewed the sleeves on. I promptly wove in about, 250 ends each, because each of these stripes across the body had a long, remember we did joining in ends last week? So each of them had a long 6-inch long tail on the other side, which I then wove into the seam. So with a needle, wove in. So these seams, pretty thick, and then I draped it on myself and sort of pinned the body and sleeve seams together, those ones. And guess what? It was super bunched up and tight around the arm, like unwearable. And I nearly wept, because it was like all that work, and I had ruined it. And because I had woven in all those ends, I couldn't undo it. I sat there trying to unpick it and nearly just in tears of frustration, because I'd ruined the thing after all of that hard work. And so I did what knitters do. I put it in a bag in the back of the closet and left it in the naughty closet for a while. And then we were getting ready to go on vacation to the U.S. We were going back to visit my family for a couple weeks in the U.S. And I knew a woman in the Knitters Guild in New South Wales. She taught knitting classes at the knitting shop where I was a customer, and where I worked at Morris & Sons, which was then called Tapestry Craft back in Sydney. And her name was Anne. And Anne would occasionally help people with repairs and stuff. And so I went to Anne and I said, Anne, I have this jumper and I ruined it. Would you please help me fix it? And she went, okay, give it to me. And I gave it to her, and I asked her to just see if she could get the sleeves off so that I could have another go. Because not only had I sewn them on too tight, I also think I casted off the sleeves too tightly at the top. You know, when you finish the edge of your top knitting, you don't want to finish that edge too tightly, or else it'll be very tight and bindy and not soft and stretchy like the rest of the knitting. Like, you know, my sleeve cuff here, the edge is nice and stretchy, but you know, if I did it too bindy, it would be much tighter and not stretch. And so I really just wanted her to unpick the sleeves where I joined them on badly. And when I came back in, it was 2.5, 3 weeks, she gave me the finished jumper. Not only had she unpicked the sleeves, she undid the cast-offs, recast it off. She then attached the sleeves, did the rest of the seams, and knitted the damn collar on for me. She completely finished the project, which, I mean, I would have liked to have done that part, but you know what? She did a really wonderful job, and it is the best finished jumper that I have because I didn't actually do it. And I actually love it. I mean, like I said, it's huge. It's sort of an oversized 80s jumper. The colors, you know, probably look muted in the little video, but as you can see, quite bright. And I just love it. It's a great one to wear sort of as an outer layer on other things. So it's called Solstice. It is by Joe Sharp, an Australian designer. Interestingly enough, like I looked it up on my Ravelry project page, which, okay, just a little bit of a warning, heads up warning here. My project photo for this on Ravelry is terrible, but that's, oh, that's the project. I look like a stoner. What is with me? I look like I just woke up. Yeah, and that is obviously in Rod's office, which is why there's crap everywhere around us. But this is many years ago, more than 10 years ago, of course. And yeah, so there I am wearing my completed solstice jumper, so you can see the whole effect. But it comes in 2 different colorways, as I recall. There's sort of a more muted blue and sort of a natural colorway. But I looked on Ravelry this morning, and only 9 people have knitted this and put it on Ravelry. This photo is the official Ravelry project photo, which I don't understand, people. This is a wonderful jumper. I'm actually kind of tempted to knit the other colorway for Rod because it's a fun knit, you know, you can knit it out of any 8-ply as long as you've got the right sort of colors. So I would urge you to look it up. It's Solstice, like the autumn, you know, vernal, not the equinox, the solstice. And it's in one of Joe Sharp's books. But I really liked it. And thank you to Ann Westron for helping me rescue it, because otherwise it would probably still be sitting in the closet. And thank you, Margaret. Yes, I do look that is because I was very young in that photo. That was, like I said, quite a long time ago. Actually, that was in our first house in Chippendale, not the one we've lived in. So well more than 12 or 13 years. That's probably 15 years ago, to be honest with you. That's probably 15 years ago. But that is Solstice. That's what I'm wearing today. I didn't actually bring all of my sweaters to Germany. People thought I brought everything. I didn't actually bring everything because first of all, I knitted a lot more earlier on. You know, I was really churning out the projects for myself, for my nieces, for my nephews, for my sisters, for my sister and brother, for my family, for Rod. But then eventually you've sort of knitted something for everyone, and you just knit for yourself, and you sort of slow down the production, especially as my career is ramped up. So I don't knit as much as I used to, but I still have like bags of sweaters and scarves and hats back in Sydney. You know, some of the less successful ones I've taken to Goodwill, but some of them I've left in storage back in Australia. And the warmest ones I brought here, because that's one of the advantages of living in a cold climate for a while, is I can actually knit and get more wear out of my woolens. Australia has, even in the dead of winter in Sydney, doesn't get that cold. So it's hard to wear anything thick or very warm. Okay. I did have to join in another ball of wool, by the way. That's this is a fresh ball. So I am now on my third Yeah, so there's pretty much an entire ball of wool through this body of the blue. So I'm on my third ball of the blue, and I've got, I think, 2 more to do the sleeves. I think I bought 5 all up, so it should be plenty. Should be plenty, I think, because I'm not going to use this whole ball. I think I'll finish the body before I finish this whole ball, so it should be enough. But hey, you know, it's. I thought I was going to have plenty, but maybe I'll need another one. It's possible. It's an argument for either the short sleeves or I could go back to the knitting shop and try and buy another ball. That's probably a good point to introduce the concept of dye lots. I think I mentioned it on one of the previous streams. But for the non-knitting muggles, you know, when wool is dyed, you know, when they literally take the natural color wool and they put the color on it, what they do is they number the batches that they dye them in. And so when you buy a batch of wool for a project, you need to be sure, or if you're buying wool for someone for a gift to make something, you want to look at the ball band, at the actual label on the wool, and make sure that the number for the dye lot is the same for all the lot that you're buying, because otherwise, chemistry being what it is, there can be a slight difference. And while, look, on this jumper, the one I'm wearing, if this orange and this orange were slightly different, you are not going to know because it's mixed in with other colors. They're not sitting next to each other. You're probably not going to know. However, if I joined in a new ball in the middle of my stomach here and the dye lot was slightly different, you would 100% see it, and it's going to look stupid. So you really want to make sure if you're knitting blocks of solid color that you buy all the same dye lot. And that's where knitters get into trouble. You know, when they buy the wool for the project, you always try and buy an extra ball or two. And that's why most knitting shops are good, and they'll let you exchange the extra if it's a good shop. Because if you run out, there is no guarantee that when you go back to buy more, you will get the same dye lot. I am fairly optimistic that I would. The shop had a fair few when I was there, and you know, given that this is a finer weight wool, I don't imagine very many people are buying, like me, buying a sweater quantity of it. So I think the chances if I did need another ball are pretty good that they would have it. But I mean, I have thought about the fact that I should ride over there. Unfortunately, right now, everything's closed because of our lockdown. But if it weren't, I would maybe be tempted to go over and buy one more ball right now and lock it down just to be sure that I had enough. But yeah, dye lots, very important and not something you necessarily learn about when you're young and you're learning the mechanics of knitting. You don't think about that, but it can absolutely, so it's another thing you can do, a little decision that will absolutely ruin your lovely knitting if you're not careful. There are, like, sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes you run out and there is no more of the dye lot. You know, on Ravelry in the groups, you will sometimes see people posting desperate saying, I need one more ball of this dye lot. Does anyone in Australia have this that they would send me? And sometimes there is none left, in which case what you do, you have to kind of try and come up with ways around it. I mean, one of the things you can do is, like if it was a jumper and you had one dye lot for the body and one dye lot for the sleeves, that isn't as bad because there's a natural, you know, a seam line where the sleeves join in probably, as long as it's not a seamless jumper. So if you can put some sort of a break between them, that can help to disguise the color jump. It's really where the stitches are like right next to each other continuously. That's the problem. So you can try and put in a break. You could put in a stripe of some kind, or a row of eyelets or some design element to try and break up the transition a little bit. The other thing you can do is if you have more, say, equal quantities of the two dye lots. And this is also something that's good to do with hand-dyed yarns, because if you're buying yarn from an indie dyer or indie spinner or dyer, they don't do giant quantities when they do their dye lots. They may only do a few hanks or skeins at a time. So it might be that you literally cannot get enough of one dye lot for a garment. So what you often do there, like if this were an indie dyed wool and I didn't have enough, is I would take my 2 different dye lots and I would alternate rows. So I would knit one row in one dye lot, the next row in the next dye lot, and alternate throughout the entire garment. Because what I'm going to do then is I'm going to sort of blend it. you will end up getting a blended effect of the two. You won't see a harsh line. Yes, Woban, you make a design feature rather than a mistake. Exactly. So yeah, you can mix two dye lots together by doing that. I mean, if you want to sort of, you could knit sort of a section where you did that and then transition from one to the next, but I still think that will probably, depending on how close or how far they are, you could still see the difference. So safest thing to do with indie dyed, hand dyed yarns is to actually alternate throughout the whole thing. But thankfully on this one, I bought all the same dye lots, so I don't have to worry. But yeah, so I have joined in. Like I said, I'm on my third ball here. I got 2 more days of work next week, which, we're doing some team events and basically some meetings and stuff to wrap up the year. And then I've got this a week and a half off, basically. So, and since it's lockdown and we have very few friends here and no family, we're not going anywhere. So I'm hoping I should be able to finish off the body soon, before New Year's. And then we have, I don't know if we've officially announced it, but it is on the schedule. There is secret, more reInvent content coming in January. We are going to have more sessions, which means theoretically, through a loophole, I could still meet my goal of finishing before reInvent officially ends if I get the sleeves done before that content finishes airing in January. So knock on wood, I will make that happen. Yeah, running out of a dye lot is like, you really feel for those people. And I remember people coming into the knitting shop just desperate, trying to find more. So always, if you're buying for someone, never buy the exact number that's stated in the pattern. Always overestimate just to be safe. Like I said, it's good knitting shops will take the extra back and give you store credit. That's what we always did. Or you have it and you make a beanie out of it. Or, plus that gives you a little extra to make your gauge swatch, as we talked about last week, which you should do for fitting, which sometimes some of us who are more experienced don't. But, actually that can be a source of emergency extra wool. You knit your gauge swatch, you set it aside, you knit the garment, and you find yourself, as you get down to the end of the wool, playing, as we call it, yarn chicken, which is where you're seeing if you can finish the design before you run out of wool. And sometimes you play yarn chicken and you win, and sometimes you lose. And if you lose, one thing you can do is unravel your gauge swatch. If you were smart enough to make one, you can actually unravel that wool, because that matches, and use your gauge swatch wool to finish the garment. Another thing that I have done, I was finishing a scarf in a Noro yarn, and it was a design, normal scarf is rectangular. You run out of yarn, you just finish it. But this one was actually sort of diamond shaped. And so it actually had a pattern that you had to knit at the end to get down to the point. And of course, I ran out of wool with like an inch to go of just a tiny bit. I just needed a tiny bit left. So what I did is I went back through the rest of the scarf, wherever I had brought in new balls, and I had the ends hanging there. Remember, we left long ends, 6-inch long ends to weave in. I went back, wove in each end just a little bit, and broke off, the 4-inch piece that was left over. So I had all these 4-inch pieces left. And then I painstakingly felted them together, like we did a few streams back. I was knitting outdoors at a knit-in, so I felted them. So that scarf has a lot of my DNA in it, but I painstakingly felted all the woven in ends that I'd cut off into a long string and managed to get a long enough piece to finish and cast off the end of the scarf. But that was the worst. I've also knitted socks where I ran out before, if you're knitting socks from the top down and you run out before the toe, I have knitted, at least then you just knit the toe in another color and it looks intentional. So that's, you got to, as we said, as Woban said there, you make a design feature out of it rather than highlighting that it's a mistake. But yeah, there are tips and tricks you can do if you have to get around a dye lot problem. That's not so much yarn chicken as yarn taking the eggs and raising the chicks. Absolutely, absolutely. I got quite a bit of knitting done this week. I'll tell you, well, just unsolicited endorsement here. I randomly, Dairy Girls is on Netflix, and I'd seen it recommended to me a lot, and I'd never actually watched any of it. And so I clicked on one and watched it, and I loved it, and I binged both series, both available series in one week. It's very cute. It is not at all what I expected. It's set in Northern Ireland, in Derry, Londonderry. It's very funny. Granted, I'll just warning to any other Americans or non-native English speakers, the Northern Irish accent, if you're not used to it, look, it's perfectly understandable, but I would say there's still maybe 15% of the dialogue. A couple characters talk really fast where I just couldn't understand that, but you can get it from context. You can understand most of what they say, and it's hilarious. It's set in the 90s as well, which I loved, all the 90s music, the 90s, clothing. And it's just very funny and charming, and I highly recommend Dairy Girls, and you can get quite a bit of knitting done to it. So there's quite a bit of Dairy Girls woven into this sweater. So I did have a topic I wanted to talk about a little bit beyond just project knitting. There was a tweet this week someone tagged me in, which was, "What's good software for making knitting patterns? Stitch Mastery kills my PC. Excel isn't great." And this is Floor Drees on Twitter. And so what Floor Drees is talking about is picture knitting, is taking, a pixelated image and turning it into a knitting chart so you can knit from. And one of the things I think I wanted to highlight to people who, again, non-knitting muggles, no shame, but you might expect that that a knitted stitch is square, and actually it isn't. That's one of the first problems you run into when you're trying to do something like Floordries here is doing, is that knitted stitches are inherently wider than they are tall. They're rectangles. So if you knitted something that was, 20 stitches wide by 20 rows tall, it would not be a perfect square. It would be a slightly wider than it is tall rectangle. And so if you take a picture, like a lot, 8-bit videogram graphics, for example, are a very common thing to want to knit because they make great charts. But they're not going to look the same. They're going to look slightly horizontally stretched out if you actually just chart them and knit them straight. And so you have to account for that. And so as you can see, what this person has done, they're using Excel here, is they've stretched the cells to be a little bit wider. They're not perfect squares, and that's one way of doing it, is to just sort of eyeball it. There is another thing you can use, and they do make special graph paper for knitters. So when I've done this in the past, and I'll show you an example of one that I did, you can Google the phrase knitter's graph paper. And so knitter's graph paper, there's a site, I've forgotten the URL, it's Tata something, but if you Google it, you'll find it. Someone built a little tool where you can enter your specific gauge. So remember, like if you've done a gauge swatch and you know that you're getting 22 stitches and 30 rows per 4-inch, you can enter that in, and it will generate you a PDF of custom graph paper exactly to that gauge. So you will know what it will look like when you knit it. You can then download that PDF and use that to plan your design. And so I have a nephew, Kurt, who is now in university, but when he was younger, well, he still is probably, he was very into Tintin, which is, the Belgian comic, the character. And so Kurt loved Tintin, and I wanted to knit him a Tintin sweater, and I couldn't find any official patterns, and I thought I would just make my own. And so knowing about this, what I did is I found I scanned in an image of Tintin, and I had that as a layer in like my image editor. And then I downloaded knitter's graph paper to the specific gauge that I wanted to use. And I used an image editor to overlay them, to put the knitter's graph paper on top, sort of, and then adjust the transparency. And then because it was like tracing, basically imagine if you're doing it with paper. You could also do it with paper, I guess, if you printed out the knitter's graph paper and your image. And then I went through and colored it. And so the result, this is what the jumper looked like. And so it's Tintin and Snowy. This is the jumper I knitted for Kurt several years ago. But you could see if I hadn't done that, if I had just knitted it straight, with a square grid, Tintin and Snowy's faces would have been too wide. They would have been stretched out horizontally. So the way you keep the perspective right and the way you make this look nice is by using knitter's craft paper, and that's what I did. So, the tweet by Floordries was asking for specific software, and I take it there is some specific software. The problem is a lot of knitters will use something for cross stitch, because there's lots of software for making your own cross stitch designs, but cross stitches are square. So you can't just use a cross-stitch design maker and use that to do your Intarsia designs. You're going to look, it's not a problem. Maybe it's a flower or something. If it's slightly stretched out, it's not going to be the end of the world. But if you're knitting a face or something that you want to be square, it's not going to work. So that's why you use knitter's craft paper. Or if you look up that tweet from Floordries, people did suggest a few tools in the, actually I might have it. Let me just see, what were the tools people mentioned here? So someone said, and stitchfiddle.com. There's a few other tools mentioned that people had built that are mentioned in the Twitter thread. And I'm just going to hit retweet right now on the thread. So if you follow me on Twitter, I'm web_goddess. I've just retweeted the thread. So you can go and have a look at some of the other things mentioned. I see Mariko Kosaka commented in there, and Mariko is really cool, has done some great talks on knitting and programming, and actually built a cool tool called the Sweaterify, where you could upload a design and see it sort of plotted on an ugly Christmas sweater, and then it would generate the pattern for you. So there's a few different tools mentioned in there. So if you are doing Intarsia, if you're doing something like Tintin, or you want to put your dog or a favorite image onto a sweater, use knitter's graph paper or have a look at that Twitter thread and see some of the tools that are recommended. And yeah, if you have similar knitting questions, or feel free to tweet me during the week or send me a message. I will be happy to talk about them on the stream in future weeks. Not a problem. And we're getting back to the end of the round again. So there's my stitch marker. So that marks, I actually put the stitch marker in the middle of one of the underarms. So that's where I'm starting and ending my row. So you can see if you follow it all the way down, it goes down to the armpit. So that's the start and end of my round. So for example, when I finish it off, I will start and end my cast off row at that point, rather than in the middle of my stomach or someplace where it's more noticeable. It's fine. It's not so much an issue when you're knitting in one color like I am, but if I were doing stripes, I would get a jog there. I'm knitting around and around in a spiral here with these circular needles. And a spiral, if you change colors, it will not line up nicely. It won't be seen. So that's why this is, and you can actually see the seam. This is sewn, but you see the stripes there's a little bit of a jog at the seam. But for the most part, at a seam line, you can get stripes that go straight across, but you can't really get that when you're doing circular knitting. You will get a jog. And yes, there are techniques people say, knit the stitch under the one, and you can kind of try and disguise it a little bit. But the easiest thing to do is also make sure you put that jog in a place that's going to be less noticeable. And so, actually, on this jumper in the yoke, the jog happens, the start and end of the round, they specify, happens on the back shoulder. And you can't actually tell because with this sort of a pattern, it's hidden. It's hidden, for the most part, it's hidden in the pattern. I don't know if I can actually spot it for you. Don't think so. Other jumpers knitted in the round, you can spot the jog. But this one, because it's a ferrule pattern, you can't actually really see where the jog happens. but I'm not counting rows anymore anyway. I don't really need it, and in fact, I've moved, like I said, I've moved it to the underarm. It was on the back. Normally, the back left shoulder raglan seam line is where it is in a Fair Isle jumper. You want to put it in a, not in a place where the eye is immediately drawn when you're looking at someone's garment. So under the arm or back left shoulder tends to be where it goes. Oh, I forgot to grab. Let me just quickly grab something. So last week I showed you the digger sweater that I was blocking. Be good to show you the finished result of that. So give me 1 second to grab it. So this is the sweater I knitted for my cousin's son, and it didn't get done, and then I was going to give it to her other son, and then it didn't get done, and now another cousin has had a baby, so I'm going to try and finish it and send it to him. But this is the digger sweater, which is a cardigan for a child, and it's got 4 different construction equipment around it. So there's the steam shovel digger, it's got a steamroller on the back, it's got a bulldozer, and a dump truck. And I just love the colors. It's knitted in 8-ply. And one of the things I should mention is the writing. So the picture knitting, just like we said, I can turn it so you can see the inside. So the picture knitting, you actually knit the bulldozer and stuff, you knit it in, like I was saying with Tintin. That's knitted in. So I would actually have, and it was kind of hectic for a while there through this section of the jumper, because I would have a piece of blue to do across this bit, then I would switch to yellow, then I would have another piece of blue, then another piece of yellow, then another piece of blue, because unlike with Fair Isle, like I did with the top of Lenatus, if you look inside Lenatus, if I turn it inside out, I've got the blue and the white going together. I carry the yarn I'm not using. So see these strands? When I'm between white stitches, I float it. That's the other word for it, a float. You float the yarn you're not using behind the other stitches. So you're only ever using 1 strand of blue and 1 strand of white through all of this. But with intarsia, with picture knitting, you don't do that. I'm not using just 1 ball of blue and then I have a big float across the dump truck. There's lots of reasons you don't want to do that. I mean, first, it messes up the tension a little bit to have a really long float. Second, if you have a really long float and the child's putting it on, then get their fingers caught underneath it or something like that. So with intarsia, you actually have a separate ball or piece of wool for every area of color. Which is why it tends to look a little messier on the back side, because then I had to weave in the ends, and you don't want to weave in, you want to try and weave in the end into its own color, like you don't want to weave in yellow behind blue, because you might see a little bit of it on the front. So the inside looks a little messier. But for the writing, for the text that says digger, I didn't actually knit that in. So I knitted this bit of the ground as pure green. And what I did was I duplicate stitched that bit on afterwards. So this is a technique when you often use when you're doing intarsia, whenever there's fine details. And I actually used it on Tintin. If I go back to Tintin, I think for his face, like the line on his ear and his eyebrows and his mouth, Snowy's eyes and eyebrows. I didn't knit those details in. Those are actually, it's a form of embroidery that you do afterwards. So it's a form of embroidery, what I did with this digger. And so you actually, Swiss darning is the other name for it, duplicate stitch, but you're actually going to take your darning needle and some wool and you stitch over the existing stitch. And you can even kind of see that in the D there. You can tell that the navy is actually on top of green. But it's not too bad. And it is thicker as well. Like if you were touching it, you could tell that the digger is twice as thick because there's 2 pieces of wool there. But that's called duplicate stitch. And so when you're doing intarsia, that's how you do any areas of fine detail, any areas where you've got one color in the middle of another color and it just makes no sense to have a separate ball of wool for all that and to break your other color. So just knit it as a solid color and then do the embroidery details on afterwards. So that's what I did with that. But anyway, so this is now blocked. So you would have seen that last week. I washed it. I put it in. I actually did wash it in my washing machine. This is it's 8-ply wool, but it's machine washable because it's for small children. You really don't want to give new parents something that's hand wash only. And so I washed it on the wool cycle. I actually put it in a garment bag just because you don't want your knitting to get too stretched out when you wash it. Not that this would. It's fairly firmly knit, but it could. And so then I pinned it. So you would have seen I had it pinned out on the guest bed on a towel. And that's why it lays so flat. It's almost like it's been ironed, you know, and you can tell the bands are nice and flat because I need to sew in a zipper. This is a jacket, which is meant to have a zipper. So I think I bought an orange zipper, which should look really cute. So I've got an orange zipper to sew in by hand. You usually, with sewing in zippers into knitting, you do it by hand because there's an art to it, and I'm not great at it, so it might take me a few goes. Hopefully I'll be able to show it to you next week or the week after. You don't want to stretch, you don't want to stretch the knitting when you sew the zipper in, because then when you zip it up, the knitting will be all wavy. So you really want to try and get that tension just right. And so blocking is the first step. And you can see it makes the stitches just sit really flat and look nice like you've ironed it. And you can tell on this that I did knit it in one piece because there's no seam under the arm. So I think the actual jacket was knitted in pieces. And as you've heard throughout this stream, I suck at sewing things together, even though I'm better at it now than I used to be. But based on the whole solstice, I think that traumatized me, those drop sleeves. So I tend to avoid seams when I can. And so this pattern was written in pieces, I believe, but I adapted it. So instead, all you have to do, it told me to cast on X amount for the right front, and then there's another section which was X amount for the left front, and another section which is for the back. You add all those numbers together, okay? Take off 2 stitches for the seams on each side, but basically that gives you the total number. And then I knitted this back and forth on a long circular needle, like I did that. So I did have to purl on one side, which does mean having to do intarsia but you always do intarsia with purl. You never do intarsia in the round. You can't do intarsia in the round because I said, imagine, we're coming across with blue. As I said, we switch to yellow. We knit across the yellow. We switch to blue. We switch to yellow. We switch to another blue. We go across. If I kept going around and around in a circle, when I came back around to knit the blue again, my blue end isn't there. I left it there. So the end isn't actually where I need it to be to pick it up to knit. So you have to go back and forth like a typewriter when you're doing intarsia. So you have to be able to purl and do all of this at the same time, which, is not as easy, as you think it is. So I actually find Fair Isle in the round, even having to juggle 2 colors, way easier than doing intarsia, doing any sort of, 2-color knitting in the purl because, it's complicated. So I knitted the body up to the armpits in one piece. And so then what I did is I stopped it there. I set it up on some scrap wool, on our scrap needle. And then I started the sleeves. And so I started knitting the 2 sleeves from the wrist. And again, I believe the sleeves were knitted flat. And I said, bugger that. I adapted them to be knitted in the round. So they're knitted in the round. Yes, they are knitted in the round. So I started the sleeves. I knitted them in the round up until the armpit. So at this point, I had 2 tubes for the sleeves, and I had a big rectangle for the fronts and the backs. And so then